It is important to note that in this type of duty there is often an intentional tort conducted by an employee of the venue. The liability of an employer in negligence will depend on the actions of the employee, or contractor, and how they fall within the scope of employment. Some forms of physical contact are allowed by venue staff acting as an authorized person under Section 165, subsection 3, of the Liquor Act 1992, as they may use necessary and reasonable force to remove persons who refuse to leave. So the venue may be vicariously liable for acts of employees, or contractors, that fall within scope of employment but outside the necessary and reasonable force limits allowed by the Liquor Act. Where an employee commits a tortious act against a third party, which is expressly authorized by the employer, results from the employer's inadequate supervision of the employee or is ratified by the employer is personally liable to the third party for the tort. Employers are also vicariously liable to third parties for tortious acts of the employee, which are impliedly authorized, that is, acts committed while the employee is acting within the scope of his or her authority. An employer may also be liable for an employee's unauthorized acts if those acts are so connected with authorized acts as they may be regarded as modes, although improper modes, of doing them. But the employer is not responsible if the unauthorized and wrongful act is not so connected with the authorized act as to be a mode of doing it, but is an independent act. To help better understand this concept, it's best to compare two similar cases, those being QBE and Orker, and also Lamble and Howe at the Moon Broad Beach Proprietary Limited. These two cases relate to persons hired as general bar staff, but were then involved in physical altercations with patrons. On appearance, it would seem that their employment contracts would have precluded them from security activities, and thus any physical tort by them would not become a vicarious liability for the venue. However, in the Lamble case, the barman would often take on some responsibilities of a crowd controller, and thus his actions were considered to fall within scope of employment. Whereas in the QBE case it was held that the barman was acting in his own independent capacity, separate from his employment. With regards to those employed solely as crowd controllers, the employer faces even stricter vicarious liability. By its very nature, physical force falls within the scope of employment. Thus, although the crowd controllers may use force that greatly exceeds that which is authorized in performance of his duties, the employer would still be vicariously liable as they would be so connected with authorized acts. Also, it should be noted that in addition to being liable to victimized patrons, venues are also liable in negligence towards security providers who harm themselves as a result of improper training. However, it is quite often the case that security services are subcontracted by venues. This has a significant impact on the liability of the venues, as the crowd controllers are not directly employed by the venue, but rather the security firm. Generally speaking, a principal will not bear vicarious liability for the tortious acts of an independent contractor, including the contractor's employees, engaged by the principal to perform work on his or her behalf. There is an exception to the general rule where the principal has directly authorized the wrongful act. However, if a contracted crowd controller is acting as a true representative of the licensed venue, then the venue would be liable as if the crowd controller was a direct employee. That is the general state of liability for venue operators. I will now hand over to Paul for our policy and social effects portion of our presentation.